my channel. Today we're going to talk about the fact that our faith can be deepened at any age and the fact that God tests us along the way to make sure that we're maturing. Let's go. Hey everybody, it's that Sunday School Girl of thatsundayschoolgirl.com. Welcome to the lesson for Sunday, March 4th. I trust that you had a fantastic day in Sunday school today as we wrapped up our quarter on faith in action. I have a personal challenge for you if you didn't see my post yesterday on social media, but take your book before you put it away and go back and look at the last several weeks, the last 12, 13 weeks as we've discussed faith, what it is, how it behaves, and really think about how your own ideas have been expanded or shaped or challenged. I promise you that these lessons are not just here for us to be in seats on Sunday mornings at 9 or 9:30, but the intent is that we will take these lessons to heart and truly be different as a result of the study that we've done in God's Word. Listen, if you're new around here, welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web, and I am so thrilled that you're here. We are learning, we are growing, we are better together because of our time in God's Word. I invite everyone, new or existing, to make sure that you look here or is she here, wherever the little icon is of that Sunday School Girl. If you click on her, you can make sure that you are subscribed to this channel and you don't miss any content when it comes out. I also invite you to share this with others, teachers, Christian education leaders, students. We are trying to get the message of Sunday school and changing the way that people see Sunday school to the world. So now we're going into a new quarter next Sunday. Hopefully you have your new books. The lesson is already posted on that sundayschoolgirl.com. But we're going to be shifting and talking about acknowledging God. And so as we go into these lessons, I want to share with you my own thoughts because I kind of sit down and do a brainstorm in the beginning of what that means and what that looks like. And I too am going to challenge myself along the journey and see how my ideas grow and shape as a result of studying this word. Before I get into the lesson, I made a promise. I had some goals set out at the beginning of this year, and one of those goals was that by this quarter coming up, the March 4th lesson, I would begin to publish my weekly notes from my Sunday school study and this video. And so I am pleased to share that this Sunday's lesson is the first of the notes that are available. I will put the link to the notes down in the comment section below this video, and you'll also see the link on that sundayschoolgirl.com. They will be available for a 99-cent download, but you'll have my entire packet. Now, let me be clear on what this is. First of all, this has been it's a challenge, but it's also very scary. It's scary because this is like showing you my diary or my journal. So let's get really clear on what these are and are not. These are just my notes. They're not a commentary. They're not a substitute for your Sunday school book. They're not taking any publisher out of business. They are truly my personal notes. And I think I've shared with you all before that I'm a visual learner. So you'll see that there are things in color. There are spaces I'm trying to find in here where maybe I have like charts that I've dropped in, and there are things that I wanted to study or I wanted to know more about. So those are my personal notes. Again, not to take the place of your reading your regular Sunday school material, but you'll notice that I show you where I found things interesting, or I underline words that I wanted to know more about, or what pulled me into a particular vein of study. So the truth is, this is what I'm looking at when I do the video because it's my personal study, but so many of you have asked for it because you say there's so much content in the video. So this becomes an easy way for you to print it before you watch the video, or watch the video and print the notes. I guess this is the new level of Cliff's Notes for Sunday school. You all have been teasing me all along. So this is the next level of Cliff's Notes, the TSSG version for Sunday school. So again, they are available. And Yeah, again, kind of scary because it's showing my diary, it's showing my personal thoughts. But I do pray that they will be a blessing and a benefit to you. And as always, as you study the lesson, I look forward to sharing your learnings as well. So please leave comments below. Let me know what you got out of the lesson in your time of study. That may be something that I can add and be enriched as I too prepare to go into class next Sunday, just like you. That's it. Let's get into our lesson for this week. Our lesson title is The Lord Will Provide. The Bible basis is Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 3 and 5 through 14. The Bible truth. Abraham trusted God to provide the sacrifice for the burnt offering. Our memory verse is verse 8, and the lesson aim is that we will explore God's call to committed personal sacrifice, appreciate the difficulty following his directives, and emulate those who make extreme personal sacrifices for God. This new quarterly theme has me like, wow, because it meets me right where I am. So I spent some time sort of brainstorming about what this theme means to me today, and I'd like to watch my own development through the quarter. But acknowledging God for me means making him my priority and seeking him, his counsel, his wisdom before I ever make any move. Keeping him in mind in everything that I do and making it a habit, not just a necessity, but a habit to seek his counsel, his direction, and to seek it often. It really is this idea that God cares about our everyday lives, and not just our lives, but the little details in it. And so I know and I expect that God can act and that he will act for me. And so it's important to acknowledge him in all that I do. Again, not just the things that I think that I cannot handle. So as we're going into this lesson this week, looking at the fact that the Lord will provide. And again, all of this resonates because of where I currently find myself. This is very personal. So I think most folks know that I have about 2 months left in law school. So everyone wants to know, well, what are you going to do next? And the answer is, I'm seeking the Lord. The Lord is going to help me with where I am to be next and what I'm supposed to do. And I'm listening for his voice and his hand and his guidance in what is to take place next. And so when I look at this title this week of our lesson, it's talking about the Lord will provide. And that is a declarative statement. It's not wishy-washy. It means that I can depend on the fact and be confident of the truth of God's word, and that is that he will provide. He makes all things possible, that it's not in my own strength. Again, I don't even have to figure it out because the capability is all in God to provide not just some of what I need, but he provides everything that I need. And we'll see in this week's lesson that a lot of what we know that we can depend on has to do with what God has done in the past. And so again, if I make this very personal, I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 6 months. But what I know is I could not have scripted the last 3 years. If I had written my own life, this would not have been the insert at this point in my life. And yet God has been amazingly faithful to me. He has not allowed me to suffer any loss. He has made every provision. There are some things I don't even know how they got accomplished, but I know that God has done it, and it was not to my detriment. And so when we think about those kinds of things and those kinds of testimonies, we know that God gives us everything that we need down to the smallest details to be successful. This week we are in Genesis chapter 22, and we are looking at the life of Abraham, and we've come to somewhat a culminating moment in his life. If you think about things that have happened in your own life, you look at small things that kind of seem to be revving up to the really big thing. That's where we are here in chapter 22 with Abraham. There are 3 characters or persons that we will see in this lesson. There is God, the provider. There is Abraham, who is called the friend of God, and he's later noted as the hero of faith. And then there's Isaac, his son, and we'll see that this father really loved his son. Chapter 22 says that it came to pass after these things that God tempted Abraham. You know what I wanted to know? After these things? After what things? After all of these culminating events in his life is the answer. You have Abraham, who has walked with the Lord and trusted his promises at this point for more than 30 years. And as he's gone through his journey, he didn't always get to know why or where or how things were to work out, but God always guided him and he made promises to him, and that's what Abraham held on to, and that was really the nature of their relationship. So after these things, Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham was called, he left everything that he knew, his family, his comfort, an ordinary man who would go off to a very extraordinary life, but he had no idea where he was going when God told him to go. It was only to a land that I will show you. In chapter 15, God makes him a promise. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and you're going to have many descendants. You won't even be able to number them, and out of your line will come the Messiah. But how would that even be possible? Because at the point of the promise, Abraham didn't even have children. But the Bible says this: he believed God. And as he continues through his journey, he and his wife Sarah are at some point disappointed because their promise isn't there yet. And they take action on their own. That whole Hagar and Ishmael story, which you should go back and check out. And the whole family situation was really uncomfortable for a while, but there was still this promise. Genesis chapter 18 is the LOL chapter where Sarah is told that she's going to have a baby, and she's like, but I'm old. Like, I'm 90 and Abraham is lifeless. How is this even supposed to happen? And it's her LOL moment as she laughs at God, but he still kept his promise intact. And the next year, the last laugh was on her because Isaac was born. The promise was fulfilled 25 years or so after it was given. And you would think that they would be at the point that this should be, and Abraham and Sarah lived happily ever after. But that's not quite what happened. What happened is chapter 22. After those things, God tests Abraham. The King James says that he tempted Abraham. Now, to tempt means to test. And I took some time to look at the difference between temptation and testing, because although they come from the same Greek root word, they do not mean the same thing. A test, by its definition, is a check of the quality of something, how it will perform, or the reliability of it before you put it on the market for widespread use. Like, you don't want to be in trouble because something didn't work out the way it was supposed to work out. And even in school, we took tests along the way to check our performance. It was to give our professors or teachers insights on how we were absorbing the material so that they could decide their lesson plans going forward. Did we need more of a certain area of study, or were we demonstrating mastery and we could move on to the next thing? In other words, the test shows us where we succeed and where we still struggle. And so this test was to prove Abraham's faith. It was to find out whether his words matched his action. There's our faith and action connection again. So again, we're noting that this is not the testing. He's not a sinner. Abraham is a man of faith and character, and his entire life has been this faith journey. Now, again, this difference between temptation and testing. Temptation appeals to sinful nature, and it makes your flesh feel a certain way, and it really has a luring about it towards something evil. In fact, temptation just knows what you like. It knows how you like it, and it attempts to weaken or break down the individual, and its purpose is to destroy the relationship that a person has with God by what it's being tempted with. In other words, it taps into an area of your flesh, but its ultimate purpose is to destroy your soul. On the other hand, testing is always outside of our comfort zone. It's something we can't figure out. We don't see how the pieces come together. But it is about examining and determining our value. And testing reveals our faith. And inside of the test, we are made better because we are strengthened. And every time we're tested, the test is tailored for the individual to teach you just what you need. And in our test, we are strengthened through the tension. So how do you know the difference between testing and temptation? You've got to consider the source. Look at who is trying to bring about the change, and you know in context whether it is a test or whether it is temptation. So, example, let's say a warm fudgy brownie with ice cream and hot fudge and whipped cream and light pecans is placed in front of me at the dinner table this evening. Is that testing or is that temptation? I'm certainly not made better for it. In fact, I would have to go to the gym for several hours to work that off. But it is something that appeals to my flesh with an attempt to weaken me. So that's just a loose way of figuring out a test versus temptation. So Abraham at this point he's more than 100 years old. And look at how this test comes. God calls out to Abraham. You don't see Abraham going, hey, God, pick me. I want to be tested today. You got anybody on the testing list? No, God calls Abraham. And this is not the first time that he is called out to Abraham. And Abraham has had double-digit tests. In fact, I share that in the notes. I found at least 14 tests of Abraham. And some he passed and some he failed. When he allowed Lot to choose the land first, he passed the test. But when he took Sarah's suggestion to go into the handmaiden Hagar, that was an epic fail. But again, God designs every single test just for us, and he uses our experiences to prepare us for the test. So God has called him to this point of testing. He says, Abraham responds, behold, here I am. In verse 2, God begins to lay out the instructions for the exam. It made me think of when we take our tests in school. Page 1 is always the instructions, and they say make sure that you read all of the instructions so that you don't get off on tangents or answer questions that you're not asked, and you're focusing on the issue that you're supposed to see. This is basically the instruction, and he's telling Abraham what to do. So you notice the action words that are in this verse. He has two verbs here. He is to take his son and to offer him. Now let me pause and say that this lesson is going to get, it's got potential for mixed feedback because we're dealing with this conversation of Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son. And so I'm even prepared this week on this video for a certain commentary about child sacrifice and whether God would require it. I'm not going to go off on that tangent because I think that there are bigger lessons that we're supposed to see. And we certainly know that God did not require him to sacrifice his son, but there is a test of the faith in play. So Abraham has been told to take and to offer his son. Abraham again has walked with the Lord, and he's trusted his promises now for more than 30 years. And he now says, offer up your son, that thing that you've waited on, that promise that you worked hard for, that you waited this many years for, the one that you love, the promised son, the one that's brought you laughter. Isaac's name meant laughter. He's brought laughter and joy to his parents. He was the awaited promise, the awaited blessing. And not only that, but there was still a promise attached to Isaac. All of your generations, this seed that you weren't going to be able to number, were going to come through this son. But how would it be possible to sacrifice this son who didn't even have children of his own yet, and that promise still be fulfilled? Now, Leviticus outlines offerings and how they were to be made up, and some of the offerings were offered up to impart to the priest, but the burnt offering itself was to be completely sacrificed. Everything, the bones, everything would be consumed. There would be nothing left over. Very much this is the idea, even in the sacrifice that Abraham is making. It has a parallel to our lives as Christians. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, Paul says that our lives as Christians are really worship, and it's worship that we completely give over to God. And that's what this test was really all about for Abraham. Would he be willing to give everything completely over to God, even that which he loved? And so take and offer, he says, your only son. Now, at take and offer, Abraham could have paused and said, oh, but I have two sons, because he hadn't said which son yet. But then the Lord clarifies. Now, there was Ishmael, but Ishmael at this point is gone. And let's be clear, Abraham loved Ishmael. When it was time to send him away, he really didn't want to. That hurt him to do that. But at this point, Isaac is the only son. Ishmael has been sent away, and Isaac is the only son. As a matter of fact, that is repeated 3 times in this text. He is the only son. Now everything falls to Isaac. And not only is he the only son, but he says that he's the one that you love. Here's the issue. Here's the real issue that we're now dealing with. We have the stage that's set. Abraham is caught in a very tough place. God has asked him to do something really tough. He's between 2 loves. He has God whom he loves, and he has his son that he loves. And his love for God is so strong, and yet he has that love of a parent. And so there's that challenge that he has to figure out how to work through. How does my commitment to either one show in this? The difficulty again was this fact that his son still had this promise on him that future generations would come through him. Notice the construct of how God gives the command. He says for him to go take his son and to offer him. And it's constructed in the same way that Genesis chapter 12:1 is constructed, when he tells Abraham to go to a land that I will show you. So even when he talks to Abraham here in verse 2, he says to go to one of the mountains that I will tell you of. So again, he doesn't get all of the directions, and it's constructed in the same way it was when he was called to leave. In the next section in verses 3 and 4, which 4 is not printed, but we see that faith obeys. We see Abraham's response is an immediate action. There is no delay in what God has said, and we see Abraham is willing to give complete obedience. Despite the fact that he's torn between these 2 loves, he's willing to give God his complete obedience. No debate. No running from God. No Jonah behavior. No hiding his son Isaac. God gave him direction, and Abraham obeyed. You notice that he doesn't even sleep in the next day. He puts in the work. He gets up and he does what needs to be done. Let's talk about this. Obedience to what God tells us to do isn't always the easiest thing to do. Again, there are pieces sometimes that we don't understand, and what he may say to us, especially when you look at the story of Abraham, it was alarming what God was telling Abraham to do. And he doesn't even know the how, doesn't know how everything is going to work out. But even take a look at this. I looked at how Abraham even got ready. Yeah, he got up early the next morning, but he went out and saddled the donkey first and then came back in and prepared everything to go on it. Like, that's the equivalent of going out and starting up the car and then coming back in the house to get everything ready. So it just seems to me that maybe he was a little bit frazzled about what was going to take place that day. And so it was not easy. Even though he didn't have the pieces, here's what Abraham did have. The first thing that he had was the pattern of God's past. I talked about this last week. My pastor taught Sunday school with our children, and he gave the illustration: pink, pink, green, blue, pink, pink, green, blue, pink, pink, what comes next? And the answer, of course, was green, blue. And we know that because of the pattern. And so Abraham has a pattern with God. He knows from his past that God is faithful. The second thing that he definitively has, and we've talked about this twice, is the promise that is still attached to Isaac. And so verse 4 is not printed, but it tells us that he made a 3-day journey. He's on foot. He takes these 2 young men and he says, you all stay here with the donkey and I and the lad. That is a compound subject. We are going to go up there and we are going to worship and we will come again. Now, all of that was very loaded. First of all, this is the first time we see the word worship in the Bible. And again, this is we. We are going to go. We are going to come back. So when he makes his statement, at no point does he not believe that he's not going to come back down with his son? As Abraham makes a statement that he's going to sacrifice, he is assured of the power of God. This really spoke to me because we oftentimes find ourselves in very, very scary places, but we can't allow our language to conform to our insecurities or our emotions. Our language has to be in the firmness of what we know about God. The other thing that we eventually learn about Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, go take a look, is that he knew all along that God had resurrection power. He could bring life from anything that was dead. And so these were all confidences that Abraham had. Verses 6 through 8 shows us that faith gives confidence. And Abraham is now, he's taking the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son. And he took the fire in his hand and the knife. And you look at this, and all of a sudden, while he's prepared, with knife in hand, he's got everything that he needs. He's got the wood. He's going to make this sacrifice. I forgot this part. Look at how they're moving and how they're preparing. Now, at this point, Isaac is a young man. He's old enough to have seen sacrifice being made. As a matter of fact, here he says, while he's walking with his father, "Hey, Dad, I see the wood. I see you got a knife. I see you got fire, but in the past, you've always had an animal of some sort, and I don't see an animal today." And his father tells him that the Lord will provide. He's very confident that the Lord will provide. And as they're moving, notice also that he's young, but he's strong enough, so he's old enough to carry the wood. Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the dangerous things. The father had he was still a protector. He had the dangerous part, the fire and the wood. Also, look at this. Isaac submitted to this process. He's old enough to know what's going on and to carry wood, which means he could have broken away and run at any point in time. And I'm almost positive that his more than 100-year-old father might have had a challenge chasing after the young man. But he submits to the father's leading as his father places this wood on his back and they go up to this place. The word provide in this text means to see. The Lord will provide. In other words, God would cause something to appear. He would cause the sacrifice to appear. And so on the Lord's mountain, the one that he would choose, on the unnamed mountain at that point, he would choose the sacrifice that would appear. So now we get to where I almost jumped a few minutes ago. You have this heightened moment where the father is up the mountain, the son has allowed himself to be bound and laid on the altar, and Abraham has this knife in the air, and he's completely willing to obey God when the King James says, "Behold," or suddenly there was a ram that appeared in the thicket. He was caught by his horns. You've got all of this adrenaline, this moment where Abraham hasn't stopped believing God or what he was capable of doing, even though he didn't know when or how. The angel of the Lord, the Bible says, speaks out of heaven and says, "Don't lay a hand on your son." God was never going to require a human sacrifice. That would have been out of his character. That was the nature of pagan gods, and God is not like pagan gods. Here God provided, and I thought this was interesting. I probably won't have time to parse it all out, but take a look at the ram and the thicket. This ram, it's an adult, a mature sheep, not a lamb. Specifically, the details that he's mature enough to have horns, and that's what catches him up in the thicket. The sacrifice had to be an unblemished sacrifice, and so the fact that his horns are holding him means that there are not thorns that are tearing away at the skin. So an unblemished, undiseased sacrifice would be what was required. In this thicket, a thicket is a Hebrew word meaning to be entwined or entangled, a very bushy collection of plants and trees and shrubs that have basically grown together. Their branches are something that cannot be penetrated, and they're joined together even at the roots like a single plant. I thought this was interesting, that God's provision was in something that appeared entangled, wrapped together, twisted together, interwoven, ensnared. The ram itself, the solution, was inside of a confused condition. And yet at no point was Abraham like the ram. He was never confused at all. He was never entangled in his mind because his faith was solid enough to reflect on what he knew about God. Hebrews tells us to lay aside sin and weight and things that easily entangle us. And sometimes it seems like God has the answer, but it is wrapped up in what appears to be a mess. Verse 14 tells us that Abraham named that place Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide, because God provided for him that day. And we know that he and Isaac did return, and God's promise was kept. The line of Abraham continued through Isaac and ultimately got us to the point of the Messiah. But it was all possible because Abraham believed in, obeyed, and acknowledged God in all that he did. Here's another piece that you'll want to take a look at as you study this lesson. There are really some key parallels that you will see that point to the Messiah through the story of Isaac. Verse 2 tells us that we are in the land of Moriah, which is the mountain range area surrounding Jerusalem. And 2 Chronicles gives us a cross-reference that tells us that Mount Moriah is also Calvary. So years later, there would be another son who would walk up a hill. His journey took him up a hill. It would be a story where a father is sacrificing his only son. The story of a father who loved his son, who offered his son on a mountain, on a hill. He was offered at the hands of his father. When Jesus went up, he traveled with donkeys. 2 men accompanied him. There were thorns present in the story. Here we saw a ram in the thickets, held by his horns. And in the story of Calvary, we see the crown of thorns that are placed on Jesus' head. And in both cases, we see the sacrifice. God provides the sacrificial lamb. In the case of Isaac, it was the ram in the thickets. In the case of Jesus, he himself was the sacrificial lamb, the substitute for sin. And in both cases, we see love, submission, and compassion demonstrated in all parties. Here are my key learnings from this week. First, as we look at acknowledging God, our faith will continually be tested. There is a terrible misnomer out there that as Christians, we should live lives that never have issues, never have difficulties. Things are going to always be perfect, but that is not the promise that we have. We don't have a promise that everything is going to always be easy. As a matter of fact, you're always in one of 3 places. You either just came out of a test, you're in a test now, or you're on your way into a test. It is this continuous cycle of our lives, but we have to understand the importance of the test and the importance of passing the test. Think about it in school. You didn't have to retake the test if you passed it the first time. And God is glorified when we pass the test. I saw this too, that we're never too old to grow in our faith. We're looking at a man who was over 100 years old, and here is God giving him the biggest test of his life. And so we never get done learning. We never get done growing. We never get done increasing in ways that we can learn more about God. And so it's important that we acknowledge him in all that we do. Remember that the test is about you. It's not about anyone else. It's about you and finding out where you succeed and where you still struggle. And the tests show what we're made of, and they show what we believe about God. God knows the exact areas to test in us, and he doesn't test us outside of anything that we've been prepared to meet. Think about it in school. Any material that you were being tested over, a test was to go over things that you already learned. An assessment may be a little bit different. It may be trying to figure out what your other capabilities are, but the test is only on material that you have covered. And God knows just how much pressure we can handle in the test, and we can trust and we can depend on God when we acknowledge him, not in our own strength, but acknowledge him in everything that we do. We have the confidence, just as Abraham did, that God will provide. This is the lesson for this week. Again, I can't wait to hear what you got out of the lesson. Don't forget, if you want to get the download, you can click the link below and grab the notes from this week. Again, that's it for the lesson. I hope that you all have a fantastic week, and I will see you in Sunday school. Bye, everybody.